The North went on forever. Tyrone Lannister knew the maps as well as anyone, but a fortnight on the wild tracks that passed the King's Road up here had brought home the lessons that the map was one thing and the land quite another. They had left Winterfell on the same day as the king, amidst all the commotion of the royal departure, riding out the sound of men shouting and horses snorting, the rattle of the wagons and the groaning of the queen's huge wheelhouse. As a light snowed flurried about them, the King's Row was just beyond the sprawled castle and town. There the banners and the wagons and the columns and the knights and the free riders turned south, taking the turmoil with them, while Tyrone turned north with Benjen Stark and his nephew. It had grown colder after that, and far more quiet. West of the Row were Flint Hills, grey and rugged, with tall watchtowers on the north stony summits. To the east, the land was lower, the ground flattened to rolling plains that stretched away as far as the eye could see. Stone bridges spanned swift, narrow rivers, while small farms spread in rings around holdfast walled in wood and stone. The road was all well trafficked, and at night, for their comfort, there were rude inns to be found. 3 days' ride from Winterfell, however, the farmland gave way to dense woods, and the King's Road grew lonely. The Fall Hills rose higher and wilder in each passing mile, until the 5th day they had turned into mountains. Cold, blue-gray giants with stegged promontories and snow on their shoulders. When the wind blew from the north, long pumes of ice crystals flew from the high peaks of the light banners. With the mountains a wall to the east, the road veered north by northeast through the wood, a forest of the dark oak and evergreen, and blackberry that seemed older and darker than any Tyrone has ever seen. The Wolf's Wood, Benjen Stark called it, and indeed their nights come alive with the howls of the distant packs, and some not so distant. Jon Snow albino the howls of the distant packs, and Jon Snow's albino direwolf picked up his ears at the nightly howls, but never raised his own voice in reply. There was something very unsettling about that animal, Tyrone thought. There were 8 in the party by then, not counting the wolf. Tyrone traveled with 2 of his own men, as Benefit a Lannister. Benjen Stark had only his bastard nephew and some fresh mounts of the Night's Watch, but at the edge of the Wolf's Wood they stayed at night behind the wooden walls of the forest, holdfast in there joined up with another of their black brothers, one Euron. Euron was stooped and sinister, his features hidden behind his beard as black as his clothing, but he seemed as tough as an old root and as hard as stone. With him were a pair of ragged peasant boys. From the fingers, Reapers, Euron said with a cold look at his charges. Tyrone understood. Life on the wall was said to be hard, no doubt about it. Was preferable to castration. 5 men, 3 boys, a direwolf, 20 horses, and a caged raven given over to Benjen Stark by Maester Luwin. No doubt they made a curious fellowship for the King's Road, or any road. Tyrone noticed Jon Snow watching Euron and his sullen companions. With an odd cast to his face that seemed uncomfortable, looked dismay. Euron had twisted shoulders and a sour smell. His hair and beard were matted and greasy, and full of lice. His clothing old, patched, and sullen to wash. His 2 young recruits smelled even worse, and seemed as stupid as they were cruel. No doubt the boy had made the mistake of thinking that the Night's Watch was made up of men like his uncle. If so, Euron and his companions were a rude awakening. Tyrone felt sorry for the boy. He had chosen a hard life, or perhaps he should say that the hard life has been chosen for him. He'd rather less sympathy for his uncle. Benjen Stark seemed to share his brother's distaste for Lannisters, and he had not been pleased when Tyrone had told him of his intentions. "I warn you, Lannister, you'll find no inns at the wall," he had said, looking down at him. "No doubt you'll find some place to put me," Tyrone replied. "As you might have noticed, I'm small." One did not say no to the Queen's brother, of course, so that had settled the matter, but Stark had not been happy. "You will not like the ride, I promise you," he said curdily. And since the moment they set out, he had done all he could to live up to that promise. By the end of the first week, Tyrone's thighs were raw from hard riding, his legs were cramping badly, and he was chilled to the bone. He did not complain. He was damned if he would give Benjen Stark the satisfaction. He took a small revenge in the matter of his riding fur, the tattered bearskin, old and musky smell. Stark had offered it to him in the excess of the Night's Watch gallantry, no doubt expecting him to graciously decline. Tyrone had accepted with a smile. He had brought his warmest clothing with him when he rode out to Winterfell, and soon discovered that was nowhere near warm enough. This was cold up here, and growing colder. The nights were well below freezing now, and when the wind blew, it was like a knife cutting right through the warmest woolens. By now, Stark was no doubt regretting his chivalry impulse. Perhaps he had learned a lesson. The Lannister never declined, graciously or otherwise. The Lannister took what was offered. Farms and holdfasts grew scarcer and smaller as they passed northward, ever deeper into the darkness of the Wolf's Wood, until finally there was no more roofs to shelter under, and they were thrown back onto their own resources. Tyrone had never much used in making a camp or breaking one. Too small, too hobble, too in the way. So while Stark and Euron and the other men erected rude shelters, tended to the horses, and built a fire, it became his custom to take his fur and wineskins and go off by himself to read. On the 18th night of their journey, the wine was a rare sweet amber from the South Isles that he had brought all the way north from Castiel Rock, and a book of rumination of the history and properties of dragons. With Lord Edward Stark's permission, Tyrone had borrowed a few rare volumes of the Winterfell library and packed them for the ride north. He found a comfortable spot just beyond the noise of the camp, beside a swift-running stream with water clear and cold as ice. A groats-coily ancient oak provided shelter for biting wind. Tyrone curled up in his fur with his back against the trunk, took a sip of wine, and began to read about the properties of Dragonbone. Dragonbone is black because of a high iron content, the book told him. It's strong as steel, yet lighter and more flexible, and of course utterly impervious to fire. Dragonbone bows are greatly prized by the Dothraki, and small wandered. An archer so armed can outrage any wooden bow. Tyrone had morbid fascination with dragons. When he had first come to the King's Landing for his sister's wedding to Robert Baratheon, he had made it a point to seek out dragon skulls that had hung to the walls of Tagarin Thronehold. King Robert had replaced them with banners and tapestries, but Tyrone had proceeded until he found the skulls in the dank cellar where they had been stored. He had expected to find them impressive, perhaps even frightening. He had not thought to find them beautiful, yet they were. As black as onyx, polished smooth, so that the bones seemed to shimmer in the light of his torch. They're like the fire, he sensed. He thrusted the torch into the mouth of one of the larger skulls that made a shadow leap, dance on the wall behind him. The teeth were long, curving knives of black diamond. The flank of the torch was nothing to them. They had batted in the heat of the greatest fires, and when he moved away, Tyrone have sworn that the beast empty's eyes sockets had watched him go. There were 19 skulls. The oldest was more than 3,000 years old. The youngest were a mere century and a half, and the most recent were almost also the smallest, a matched pair no bigger than a mast's skull, and oddly mishappened. All that remained of the last two hatchling borns of the Dragonstone. They were the last of the Tagarin's dragons, perhaps the last dragons anywhere, and they had not lived very long. From there their skulls ranged upward and sized to the three great monsters of the song and story. The dragons that Agarin, Tagarin, and his sisters that had unleashed the seven kingdoms of old. The singers had given them names of the gods: Balarin, Maxus, Valgar. Tyrone had stood between their gaping draught, wordless and awed. You could have ridden a horse down a Valgar's gullet, although you would not have ridden it out again. Maxus was even bigger, and the greatest of all, Balarin, the Black Dread, could have swallowed an Aculus whole, and even one of the hairy mammoths said to roam the cold wastes beyond the port of Albion. Tyrone stood in the dank cellar for a long time, stared at Baltheron's huge, empty-eyed skull until his torch burned low, trying to grasp at the size of the living animal, to imagine how it must have looked when it spread its great black wings and swept across the skies, breathing fire. His own remote ancestor, King Lorin of the Rock, had tried to stand against the fire when he joined the King Mirren at the Reach to oppose the Tagarin conquest. That was close to 300 years ago, when the seven kingdoms were kingdoms, and not a mere province of a greater realm. Between them the two kings have 600 banners, flying 5,000 mounted knights, and 10 times as many free riders and men-at-arms. Agarin Dragalord had perhaps a fifth of that number, that the chronicles said, and most of them were conscripts of the ranks of the last king he had slain, their loyalties uncertain. The host met the broad plains of the Reach in a mist of golden fields of wheat ripe for harvest. When the two kings charged, the Tagarin army shivered and shuddered and begun to run. For a few moments, the chronicles wrote, the conquest was at end, but only for a few moments, before Agarin Tagarin and his sisters joined the battle. It was only a time when Valharin, Maxus, and Balarin were all unleashed at once. The singers called it the Field of Fire. Near 4,000 men had buried that day, and among the men cured of Reach, Lord Carin had escaped and lived long enough to surrender, pledged his battle on to the Tagarins, and beget for a son for which Tyrone was duly grateful. Why do you read so much? Tagarin looked up to the sound of the voice. Jonso was standing a few feet away, regarding him curiously. He closed the book on a finger and said, "Look at me and tell me what you see." The boy looked at him suspiciously. "Is this some kind of trick? I see you, Tyrone Lannister." Tyrone sighed. "You are remarkably polite for a bastard, Snow. What you see is a dwarf." "You are, what, 12? 14, the boy said. 14, and you're taller than I will ever be. My legs are short and twisted, and I walk with difficulty. I require a special saddle to keep me from falling off my horse. A saddle of my own design. You may be interested to know. It was either that or ride a pony. My arms are strong enough, but again too short. I will never make a swordsman. Had I been born a peasant, they might have left me out to die, or sold me some slavery Gorkisser. Alas, I was born a Lannister of Casterly Rock, and the grass growers are all the poorer. Things are expected of me. My father was the hand of the king for 12 years. My brother later killed that very same king. And it turns out my life is full of these little ironies. My sister married the new king, and my repulsive nephew will be king after him. I must do my part to honor my house. Wouldn't you agree? Yet how? Well, my legs are too small for my body, but my head is too large, although I prefer to think it's just large enough for my mind. I have a realistic grasp of my own strengths and weaknesses. My mind is a weapon. My brother has his swords, King Robert had his warhammer, and I have my mind. And a mind needs books as a sword needs a whetstone. And if it is to keep its edge. Tyrone tapped the leather cover of the book. That is why I read so much, Jon Snow. The boy absorbed that all in silence. He had the stark face, if not the name, long, solemn, guarded, a face that gave nothing away. Whoever his mother had been, she had left little of herself in her son. "What are you reading about?" he asked. "Dragons," Tyrone told him. "What good is that? There are no more dragons," the boy said with uncertainty of youth. "So they say," Tyrone replied. "Sad, isn't it? When I was your age, I used to dream of having a dragon of my own." "You did?" the boy said suspiciously. Perhaps he thought Tyrone was making fun of him. "Oh yes, even a stunted, twisted, ugly little boy can look down over the world when he is seated on a dragon's back." Tyrone pushed the bear skin aside and climbed to his feet. "I used to start fires in the bowels of Castrol Rock and stared at the flames for hours, pretending they were dragon fire. Sometimes I would imagine my father burning, at other times my sister." Jon Snow was staring at him, a look equal parts of horror and fascination. Tyrone growled, "Don't look at me that way, bastard. I know your secret. You've dreamt the same kind of dreams." "No," Jon said, horrified. "I wouldn't. No, never." Tyrone raised an eyebrow. "Well, no doubt the Starks had been terrible good to you. I am certain Lady Stark treats you as if you were one of her own. Or your brother Robb, he has always been kind. And why not? He gets Winterfell and you get the Wall. And your father, he must have good reason for packing you off to the Night's Watch." "Stop it," Jon Snow said, his face dark with anger. "The Night's Watch is a noble calling." Tyrone laughed. "You are too smart to believe that. The Night's Watch is a midden heap for all the misfits in the realm. I've seen you looking at Euron and his boys. Those are your nephews. Are your new brothers, Jon Snow. How do you like them? Sullen peasants, debaters, poachers, reapers, thieves, and bastards like you all wind up here on the wall, watching for grumps and snarks, and all the other monsters your wet nurse warned you about. The good part of is there are no grumps or snarks, and it's all scarcely dangerous work. The bad part is that you'll freeze your balls off, but since you're not allowed to breed anyway, I don't suppose that matters." "Stop it!" the boy screamed. He stepped forward, his hands coiling into a fist, close to tears. Suddenly, absurdly, Tyrone felt guilty. He took a step forward, intending to give the boy a reasserting pat on the shoulder, and muttered some word of apology. He never saw the wolf, where it was or how it came to him. One moment he was walking toward Snow, and the next he was flat on the back of the hard rock ground, and the book spinning away from him, and his fell, the breath going out of him suddenly impact, his mouth full of dirt and blood and rotten leaves. As he tried to get up, his back spasmed painfully. He must have wrenched it on the fall. In the fall. He ground his teeth. In the frustration, grabbed a root and pulled himself back to the sitting position. "Help me," he said, the boy reaching up to his hands. And suddenly the wolf between them. He did not growl. The damn thing never made a sound. He only looked at him with the bright red eyes and showed him his teeth. And there was nothing more. And that was more than enough. Tyrone sagged back to the ground and grunted. "Don't help me, then. I'll sit right here until you leave." Jon Snow stroked Ghost's thick white fur, smiling. "Ask me nicely." Tyrone Lannister felt angry and coil inside him, and crushed it out with a will. It was not the first time in his life he had been humiliated, and it would not be the last. Perhaps even he deserved this. "I should be very grateful for your kind assistance, Jon," he said mildly. "Down, Ghost," the boy said. The direwolf sat on its haunches. Those red eyes never left Tyrone. Jon came around behind him, slid his hands under his arms, and lifted him easily to his feet. Then he picked up the boot and handed it back. "Why did he attack me?" Tyrone asked the sidelong glance of the direwolf. He wiped blood and the dirt from his mouth. He wiped blood and dirt from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Maybe he thought you were a grumpkin." Tyrone glanced at him sharply. Then he laughed in a raw snort of amusement that came bursting out through his nose entirely without permission. "Oh, gods," he said, choking on his laughter and shaking his head. "I suppose I do rather look like a grumpkin." "What does he do to Snarks? You'll want to know." Jon picked up the wineskin and handed it to Tyrone. Tyrone pulled out the stopper, tilted his head, and squeezed a long stream into his mouth. The wine was cold fire as it trickled down the throat and warmed his belly. He held out the skin to Jon Snow. "Want some?" The boy shook his head. The boy took the skin and tried a cautious swallow. "It's true, isn't it?" he said when he was done. "What you said about the Night's Watch?" Tyrone nodded. Jon Snow set his mouth a green line. "If that's what it is, that's what it is." Tyrone grinned at him. "That's good, bastard. Most men would rather deny the hard truth than face it." "Most men," the boy said, "but not you." "No," Tyrone admitted. "Not me. I solemnly dream of dragons. Any more than there are no dragons." He scooped up the fallen bearskin. "Come, we had better return to camp before your uncle calls the banners." The walk was short, but the ground was rough underfoot. His legs were cramping badly by the time they had got back. Jon Snow offered his hand to help him over the thick tangle of roots, but Tyrone shook him off. He would make his own way, as he had all his life. Still, camp was a welcome sight. The shelter had been thrown up against the tumble-down wall of the long abandoned holdfast, a shield against the wind. The horses had been fed and the fire had been laid. Euron sat on the stone, skinning a squirrel. A savory smell of stew filled Tyrone's nostrils. He dragged himself over to where his man Mork was tending to a stew pot. Wordlessly, Mork handed him a ladle. Tyrone tasted it and handed it back. "More pepper," he said. Benjen Stark emerged from the shelter he shared with his nephew. "There you are, Jon. Damn it, don't go off like that by yourself. I thought the others had gotten you." It was the Grumpkin, Tyrone had told him. Laughing, Jon Snow smiled. Stark shot a baffled look at Euron. The old man grunted, shrugged, and went back to his bloody work. The squirrel gave some new body to the stew, and they ate it with a black bread and hard cheese that night around the fire. Tyrone shared around his skin of wine until even Euron grew mellow. One by one, the company drifted off into their shelters and to sleep, all but Jon Snow, who had drawn the night's first watch. Tyrone was the last to retire, as always. As he stepped into the shelter his men had built him, he paused and looked back at Jon Snow. The boy stood near the fire, his face still and hard, looking deep into the flames. Tyrone Lannister smiled sadly and went to bed.